Have you ever noticed that the smartest people in the room sometimes make the most unbelievable mistakes? It sounds impossible, yet intelligence often creates blind spots that common sense quietly slips through without asking permission. Maybe you've watched yourself overthink a simple decision, stay in a painful relationship, ignore obvious warning signs, or sabotage an opportunity you genuinely wanted. The confusing part is knowing better, but somehow doing the opposite anyway. Most people assume intelligence protects them from poor choices. In reality, the human mind doesn't separate logic from emotion as neatly as we'd like to believe. Sometimes a sharper mind simply builds more convincing excuses for decisions already driven elsewhere. That's why brilliant students procrastinate until deadlines become disasters. Successful professionals fall for scams, and highly analytical people defend habits they secretly know are hurting them. Intelligence can solve complicated problems while completely misunderstanding the person using it. If you've ever questioned your own judgment after making a decision that seemed ridiculous in hindsight, you're far from alone. The answer isn't that you're careless, broken, or secretly less intelligent than everyone else around you. The real explanation hides beneath the surface, inside psychological patterns that quietly shape every choice before logic even joins the conversation. Once you recognize them, countless moments from your past suddenly begin making uncomfortable but surprisingly liberating sense. And perhaps the most unsettling discovery is that the very ability you trust most, your intelligence, may be the reason these invisible traps keep working. Understanding why changes everything. But first, you need to see the illusion your own mind has been protecting. If you've spent years believing that being intelligent should automatically lead to better decisions, this conversation may completely change the way you understand yourself. By the end, you'll recognize why smart people repeatedly fall into predictable mental traps and, more importantly, how to notice them before they quietly take control. Perhaps you've replayed old mistakes, wondering, how did I not see that coming? You might have blamed yourself for trusting the wrong person, missing an obvious opportunity, or making choices that don't seem to match your abilities. That self-criticism feels convincing, but it rarely tells the whole story. The truth is that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Intelligence helps you process information, identify patterns, and solve complex problems. Wisdom comes from recognizing when your own mind is quietly misleading you, especially in moments charged with emotion, pressure, or certainty. Psychologists have spent decades studying the hidden biases and emotional shortcuts that influence even the brightest people. These mental patterns don't disappear because someone has a high IQ, impressive qualifications, or years of experience. In fact, intelligence can sometimes make these patterns harder to notice because it becomes easier to justify them. So if you've ever felt embarrassed by a decision that didn't reflect your true potential, you don't need more shame. You need a clearer understanding of how your mind actually works. And that begins with the first surprising lesson. The greatest danger isn't a lack of intelligence. It's the quiet confidence that intelligence can never fool itself. The greatest weakness of an intelligent mind is not ignorance but certainty. The moment you become convinced that you're too smart to be fooled, your brain quietly lowers its guard, making mistakes feel almost impossible to recognize until they've already happened. Psychologists call this overconfidence bias, a tendency to overestimate the accuracy of our knowledge and judgments. Research consistently shows that people who feel most certain about their decisions aren't always the most accurate. Confidence often reflects how convincing a story feels, not how true it actually is. Imagine spending weeks researching a major purchase. You compare reviews, watch endless videos, and analyze every detail. Eventually, you stop looking for information that challenges your choice because your brain begins protecting the decision you've already made instead of searching for the truth. The same pattern appears in relationships, careers, and everyday conversations. Once we believe we're right, we naturally pay more attention to evidence that supports our beliefs while quietly dismissing anything that contradicts them. Without noticing, intelligence becomes a skilled lawyer defending the wrong client. What actually matters is developing the humility to question your own conclusions, especially when they feel completely obvious. The smartest people aren't those who never make mistakes. They're the ones willing to admit that their minds can deceive them before reality has to do it instead. Think about the last time you insisted you knew exactly where you left your keys, only to find them somewhere completely different. Our brains can argue a case with remarkable confidence, even while the evidence is sitting on the kitchen table, patiently proving us wrong. And if certainty can fool us so easily, the next trap hides even deeper. Your brain doesn't search for the truth as often as it searches for consistency. Once you form an opinion, your mind begins collecting evidence that supports it, while quietly filtering out anything that threatens it, making you feel informed even when you're becoming increasingly biased. This pattern is known as confirmation bias, one of the most studied psychological tendencies in behavioral science. Instead of evaluating every piece of information equally, we naturally give greater weight to facts that agree with our existing beliefs and overlook those that challenge them. Imagine believing that a colleague doesn't like you. Suddenly, every short reply seems rude, every missed greeting feels intentional, and every neutral expression becomes proof that your assumption was right. Meanwhile, the moments they smile, help you, or include you barely register because they don't fit the story you've already accepted. The same thing happens online. Algorithms show us content similar to what we've already watched or agreed with, creating an environment where our opinions feel constantly validated. Before long, we mistake repeated exposure for objective reality, becoming more certain without becoming more accurate. What actually matters is deliberately exposing yourself to viewpoints that make you slightly uncomfortable. Growth rarely begins when everyone agrees with you. It begins when you're willing to ask, what if I'm missing something important? The next time you catch yourself saying, I already know how this works, pause for a moment. Your brain may have just placed an invisible do not disturb sign on new information. And surprisingly, another psychological habit makes that sign even harder to remove. Intelligent people often believe that thinking longer leads to better decisions. While careful reflection has obvious benefits, there comes a point where analysis quietly transforms into avoidance, leaving you mentally exhausted without bringing you any closer to meaningful action. Psychologists sometimes describe this as analysis paralysis. Faced with too many possibilities, the brain becomes overwhelmed by the fear of making the wrong choice. Instead of deciding, it keeps searching for one more article, one more opinion, or one more piece of reassurance that never truly arrives. Imagine someone wanting to change careers. They compare salaries, read success stories, calculate risks, watch countless videos, and ask everyone for advice. Months pass, yet nothing changes. Ironically, the person who knew less but acted sooner often gains experience, while the overthinker remains trapped in preparation. Research into decision-making suggests that excessive deliberation can actually reduce satisfaction because we become more aware of every alternative we didn't choose. Rather than feeling confident, we keep imagining that another option might have been better, turning ordinary decisions into emotional burdens. What actually matters is recognizing when additional thinking stops improving the decision and simply delays your life. Clarity often appears after taking a thoughtful step forward, not while endlessly standing at the crossroads waiting for perfect certainty. We've all spent 20 minutes deciding what to watch, only to rewatch a favorite series anyway. Sometimes the hardest decision isn't choosing wisely, it's accepting that no choice comes with a guarantee. And that becomes especially dangerous when emotions quietly begin steering the wheel, while logic believes it's still driving. One of the biggest illusions intelligent people experience is believing they make decisions logically first and emotionally second. In reality, emotions often make the choice long before logic arrives, and intelligence simply writes a convincing explanation afterwards. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio found that emotions play a crucial role in decision-making. People with damage to the emotional centers of the brain could analyze endless options, yet struggled to make even simple choices. Logic alone wasn't enough, because emotion provides the motivation to act. Think about buying something expensive. You may spend hours comparing features, reading reviews, and calculating value. Yet the final decision often comes from how the product makes you feel: successful, secure, admired, or relieved. The research supports your choice, but emotion usually sparked your desire. The same pattern appears in arguments. When someone challenges a deeply held belief, we instinctively feel defensive before we've even examined their point. Only afterwards does the mind begin constructing logical reasons to justify the emotional reaction that happened almost instantly. What actually matters is learning to recognize your emotional state before making important decisions. Asking yourself, "What am I feeling right now?" is often more valuable than asking, "What am I thinking?" because emotions quietly color every thought that follows. We've all promised never to send an emotional message, then somehow found ourselves proofreading it for the fifth time before pressing send anyway. The mind is remarkably creative when protecting the heart, and that creativity becomes even more convincing when your identity becomes attached to being right. The moment your identity becomes attached to being intelligent, learning quietly becomes more difficult. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" your mind begins asking, "What does believing this say about me?" Without realizing it, protecting your ego starts competing with discovering the truth. Psychologists call this identity protective thinking. We naturally resist information that threatens how we see ourselves because changing our minds can feel like losing a part of who we are. The stronger the identity, the stronger the resistance, even when the evidence is overwhelming. Imagine someone who prides themselves on always making good financial decisions. When an investment begins failing, admitting the mistake feels painfully personal. Rather than accepting the loss, they keep investing more time and money, hoping reality will eventually match the story they've been telling themselves. A similar pattern appears in everyday conversations. Someone corrects a fact you've confidently shared, yet instead of becoming curious, you instinctively defend your position. The discussion stops being about the information and starts becoming about protecting your self-image from embarrassment. What actually matters is separating your identity from your opinions. Changing your mind doesn't make you inconsistent or unintelligent. It often means you've learned something new. The strongest minds aren't built on always being right. They're built on remaining teachable even when the truth feels uncomfortable. We've all confidently explained something before discovering we misunderstood it completely. It's a humbling experience, but at least your brain usually whispers, "Let's never mention this again." Unfortunately, the next psychological trap doesn't just protect your ego. It quietly convinces you to keep repeating the very mistakes you're trying to escape. One of the most expensive mistakes intelligent people make is believing that because they've already invested so much, they have to keep going. Instead of asking whether a decision still makes sense today, they become trapped by everything they've already poured into yesterday. Behavioral economists call this the sunk cost fallacy. Once we've invested time, effort, money, or emotion into something, walking away feels like admitting those resources were wasted. Yet the past cannot be recovered, no matter how stubbornly we cling to it. Think about someone staying in a relationship that has been unhappy for years. They don't remain because the relationship is healthy. They remain because they've already spent so much time building it. The same pattern appears in failing businesses, abandoned dreams, and even books we force ourselves to finish despite no longer enjoying them. Research in behavioral economics has repeatedly shown that people tend to honor previous investments even when those investments have no bearing on future outcomes. Our brains confuse commitment with wisdom, convincing us that persistence is always admirable, even when persistence is quietly becoming self-destruction. What actually matters is making decisions based on where your next step will lead, not on how far you've already traveled. A choice should be judged by its future value, not by the emotional weight of its history. We've all continued watching a terrible film simply because we'd already watched an hour of it, only to lose another hour proving our first mistake. Life works much the same way. And sometimes the greatest sign of intelligence isn't knowing when to keep going. It's recognizing the courage required to stop before the next invisible trap appears. Many intelligent people believe that more information automatically leads to better decisions. But the human brain has a limit. Beyond a certain point, additional information doesn't create clarity. It creates noise, making simple choices feel surprisingly complicated. Psychologists refer to this as information overload. When we're flooded with facts, opinions, statistics, and possibilities, our attention becomes fragmented. Instead of identifying what truly matters, we struggle to separate the meaningful from the merely interesting, leaving us mentally busy but not genuinely productive. Consider someone trying to improve their health. They read dozens of books, follow countless experts, compare conflicting diets, and save hundreds of videos. Eventually, they know everything about healthy living except how to consistently eat a balanced meal or take a daily walk. Modern technology quietly amplifies this problem. Every notification, article, podcast, and social media post competes for your attention, convincing you that the next piece of information will finally provide certainty. Yet certainty rarely arrives because the search itself has become the distraction. What actually matters is learning when to stop collecting information and start applying what you already know. A small action performed consistently will almost always teach you more than endless preparation without execution. We've all opened our phones to check one message and somehow emerged 40 minutes later wondering why we walked into the room in the first place. The mind has an incredible talent for confusing activity with progress. And once that happens, another subtle psychological habit begins convincing you that your future self will somehow be different from the person you are today. Perhaps the strangest mistake intelligent people make is believing they'll behave differently tomorrow without changing anything today. We imagine that our future selves will be more disciplined, more motivated, and somehow immune to the distractions that defeat us right now. Psychologists describe this tendency as the planning fallacy. We consistently underestimate how long tasks will take while overestimating our future energy, focus, and self-control. The result is a cycle of sincere intentions followed by familiar disappointment, even though our intelligence remains unchanged. Imagine deciding to start exercising next Monday because this week is too busy. Monday arrives, bringing unexpected meetings, poor sleep, and a dozen new excuses. Nothing dramatic happened. Life simply behaved the way life usually does, while your future self quietly became your present self. Research has shown that people are remarkably optimistic when predicting their own behavior, especially regarding long-term goals. We picture ideal circumstances instead of realistic ones, creating plans that depend on perfect conditions rather than ordinary, imperfect days. What actually matters is designing your life for the person you are today, not the person you hope to become someday. Lasting change rarely begins with extraordinary motivation. It begins with ordinary habits repeated often enough that they become part of who you are. We've all promised ourselves we'll start first thing tomorrow, only to negotiate with the alarm clock like a lawyer defending a very sleepy client. The funny part is that tomorrow never argues back. It simply becomes today. And that final lesson reveals why truly intelligent people don't rely on intelligence alone. Intelligence is a remarkable gift, but it was never meant to be your only guide. As you've seen, the same mind capable of solving complex problems can also create convincing illusions, defend comforting beliefs, and quietly lead itself into mistakes without ever noticing the warning signs. The encouraging truth is that wisdom isn't built by never being wrong. It's built by becoming aware of the invisible patterns shaping your choices. Every time you question your certainty, challenge your assumptions, recognize your emotions, or admit a mistake without shame, you're strengthening something far more valuable than intelligence alone. You'll still make poor decisions from time to time. Everyone does. But each mistake can become a teacher instead of a prison when you're willing to ask not only, "What did I do?" but also, "Why did my mind believe that was the right choice?" That simple question transforms regret into understanding, and understanding into lasting growth. The smartest people aren't those who never stumble. They're the ones who remain curious enough to keep learning, humble enough to keep listening, and courageous enough to change when the evidence asks them to. Intelligence may open doors, but self-awareness determines how far you'll walk through them. If this helped you see your own mind in a new way, consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might be the insight someone else needs today, and supporting the channel helps bring more conversations like this to people who are searching for real understanding.